I think horror is just one of those genres that it's kind of hard to capture the essence of fear, I suppose, in a horror novel. I don't know about any of you, but I personally I quite enjoy a good horror movie every now and again. I enjoy a good thriller, but I think what really makes a horror movie like scary a lot of the time is not just the acting and what happens, and it's not just, oh, this monster's chasing me. It's because they add fuel to the fire by putting in like that tense music, and it kind of like it starts I don't know, bringing the tension up to here, and you're just like, what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen? Suddenly, it all goes silent or something. You're like, oh no, something's gonna happen. Something's gonna happen. And then they literally give you the like jolt of music as like something pops up, and you're like, oh, and then you jump out of your seat. I just think there's a certain kind of way that horror movies are edited and directed that enhance the fear aspect that just doesn't translate into novels. In the sense that, when you're reading, I don't suddenly get a really random sound effect to indicate that, you know, that a monster's gonna jump out and grab me. And also, like those bits in horror movies where it's like the main character is looking through the room, and then all of a sudden, like, the door swings closed behind him or something, and then you see the other person, like, stood behind the door the whole time, but the main character doesn't turn around. So it's like, that person's there, but the main character doesn't. Well, it's kind of like when you're then reading a horror novel, you're following the main character's perspective, so you don't know that the person's behind them, just in the same way that that person doesn't know the person's behind them. Anyway, but that being said, I've not read many horror novels. My other main kind of issue with horror novels is that it's so difficult to find ones that aren't Stephen King. Can we let this white man go to rest, please? Genuinely, when you look on Goodreads, for example, and you look at the horror genre, it's like all Stephen King, like 80% of it is Stephen King. And personally, I've read 3 Stephen King books. I've read The Green Mile, which isn't necessarily a horror per se. I've read Bag of Bones, and I've read It. And I also read half of The Dreamcatcher, but I DNF'd that one because that one was like an alien invasion kind of vibe, and I just realized halfway through I was like, this isn't for me. But none of those books, like, It is like one of the like top dog horror novels, you know what I mean? Like, everyone knows It. Every time you're like, I feel like I want to read a horror novel, shall I read It? So like, It was my big test because every kind of horror, I hadn't really read many horror novels, I had read the other Stephen Kings before I read It, but It was my ultimate test. I was like, okay, I want to like feel the fear that I feel when I'm watching a horror movie, but I want that to be in a book. Like, can horror books actually be scary? And so I opened up It, and it wasn't scary, like, at all to me. There wasn't really a lot to it. Like, so much of it is just them yapping about like the characters' backstories, and like, yeah, there's like, they're being chased by this evil thing, but low-key I was just like, okay. And what, like, I didn't feel the fear, I didn't feel the creepiness of it. All of this to say that I really want to further explore the horror genre. I want to get away from Stephen King. I'm sick of this white man, straight white man, if you will. I need some diversity in my life. I need to hear other people's takes on horror, because he's just personally not done it for me, and that's okay. Like, that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy his books. I gave Bag of Bones like a 5-star, although after reading It, I am on the fence about him and his character, because why did you have like 12-year-old kids gangbang a girl at the end of It in order to save them? I wasn't really comfortable with that. I didn't really like that choice very much. And so knowing that he made that choice, I'm kind of iffy about him now. I don't know if I ever will read a book by him again, because morally it's not sitting right with me here. But either way, I still think it's good to have diversity and, gain other perspectives, because his stuff, it's just not scary. And I'm on a mission to find a scary horror novel. So yeah, that being said, all of this to say, I'm going to spend the next week reading some horror novels that I have slowly collected over time. Maybe for the sake of this video, maybe not. Them being, I'm gonna read Bunny by Mona Awad. That is I don't know if it's a short story collection or not. I can't quite remember. We'll find out, I guess. And I'm gonna read The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, and Tender is the Flesh by Augusta something. I don't have my iPad on me to check, otherwise I would check, but I'll put the little covers on the screen anyway so you can have a little looky. But yeah, these are kind of, I mean, they're horror books that I own, but also I think Bunny and Tender is the Flesh, they do kind of come up quite highly on the like horror Goodreads page, which is kind of where I looked to kind of see what else was out there, which is how I know that the majority of it is Stephen King. There's definitely other horror books that I do want to read, but I just don't have yet, so I'm gonna start off there. Although The Picture of Dorian Gray keeps coming up as a horror book, and I didn't know that, and I don't know if that's true or accurate. But I do have that one, but I decided to stay away from classics for this one because I do also have Camilla, and there is also a few others that are considered horror from like the classic genre, but maybe I'll do a separate video for that because I haven't read any of those yet, and it does seem interesting. But I kind of wanted modern, kind of diverse authors. I'm pretty sure all of the authors are female. That's just in keeping with, I tend to read mainly female authors. I have nothing against men. I will read books by male authors. I just don't, I guess. I mean, they don't intrigue me, I guess. I don't know. It's just the way it's kind of worked out, you know? It was really interesting on that point because when I go through my dad's iBooks, because we have like family sharing, so I can like look at what he's bought from iBooks and then similarly like download them myself, and his is mainly male authors. Like I think that is just kind of when you kind of buy into the demographic that you are yourself in a way, just kind of subconsciously, because it's never been like a conscious decision that I've made. It's just kind of been the way that's worked out. So it's just an interesting thing that I've noticed. Anyway, moving on from that, that's not the point of this video, but yeah, I'm gonna kind of document a little, kind of like a little reading vlog, you know? Read these books with me, and we'll just see if I get the heebie jeebies. We'll see if I'm like, oh, I will say I know The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, that is a short story collection. I'm not sure on Bunny, and then I know Tender is the Flesh is quite like, I think that leans more into like the gruesomeness of horror, because I do also think there's kind of like different versions of horror, you know, sub genres of horror, I suppose. You do have that kind of like supernatural take, and then you have the really gruesome, like, oh, like it's just kind of gross, like cannibals and all that, you know. So we'll see. But yeah, I'm gonna start with Tender as a Flesh, and I will document the process. And so I have since gone to uni, come back from uni, and here I am, start of my summer, and I finished reading the 3 books, so I figured we'll just have a little chat about them, how I felt about them. Did they creep me out? Did they give me the heebie-jeebies? Was I on the edge of my seat? Was I barely looking through my fingers? Etc, etc. So the first one I read was Tender is the Flesh. This one, in a nutshell, it's about cannibalism. It's set in Argentina, in this kind of dystopian world in which we can no longer eat animals because it causes like some sort of really terrible illness. Like all of the animals have become infected, and thus we've had to like kill off all the animals and we can't eat them anymore. So of course, instead of everyone just becoming vegan or vegetarian, I suppose. But that's the thing that was really interesting actually, because it's like it wasn't even like you could drink milk, because milk came from a cow, and a cow is an animal, and therefore the milk would have been like, you know, infected as well. So it genuinely was like, instead of everyone becoming vegan, they just decided, they gradually, like all this government in these plants and everything, slowly worked at the people to push special meat, which is basically just human meat, so that we can all still have some meat to eat, and we're all just gonna pretend and like be like willfully ignorant to the fact that we're basically just eating people, and therefore they start breeding people like animals. One thing that was really interesting about this book is that instead of really focusing on this kind of like world that the writer has set up in this dystopian kind of world, they focus so much more on the main character, who works at one of the plants, and like his father was like kind of like this butcher situation, so he worked at a plant that killed cows. And obviously now he was taught from his father, and he's been able to translate those skills into the special meat, human meat market. He's very flawed as a main character, and he genuinely does some like truly horrific things. But at the same time, he's also incredibly nuanced, because the whole way through the book, he's like calling out other people and how like ridiculous the whole thing is and how horrible the whole thing is. And he goes through this phase where he like stops eating the meat because he just physically can't do it anymore, to the point where he's almost gaslighting you into thinking like, I'm better than everyone else and I'm not as bad, but then proceeds to go on and do like truly like horrific things that are like almost worse, you know. I've got a banging quote here actually that I wrote, because I'm kind of reading my notes. I'm trying to be concise today. But he almost seems to hate the system despite the fact that he plays a role in uplifting the system. And also, being a protagonist, we're almost primed as readers to assume that they're good most of the time, and it isn't helped by the main character's constant justifying of his own behaviour and critique of everyone else's. Low-key shade that. I thought overall, I think the horror factor really just comes from the fact that, like, me personally, with the state that our current, like, world is in, and the way that governments react to current situations, it's the kind of thing that I could very much see happening in real life if that specific circumstance came up. Because I think corporations and businesses and people with lots of money and people in government, they care more about business and the money they make than they care about people. And so I think if it came to it, because like one of the things that the book kind of explores is this like animals all being ill, animals all being infected, is this like a real thing, or is it like still happening, or is it kind of just like made up by the government as a scheme to then make more money and more profit off of killing people? Like, I think, like, my personal theory, I would say, from reading the book is that, like, yes, probably in the beginning, I don't think they would make something like that up. I think, like, in the beginning, it was probably the case that all these animals did get infected and they did then get ill. But whether they then, like, you know, with all the scientists in the world and with all the technology they have, like, the fact that they then never found a cure and instead started investing in this other thing, I'm like, I wouldn't be surprised in this fictional world, but also in like a real life scenario, if it was the case that they were like, oh no, well, in the meantime, let's just do this instead, let's just eat people instead, but of course, and then it was too late and they'd already invested all that money in it, and they already realized they were making a lot of money out of it, and that it meant they could easily control people and etc. And they were like, yeah, you know what, instead of actually like establishing the fact that like we found this cure, like the animals are fine now, let's just pretend like they're not and keep going, you know, with this whole big scheme we have, because we don't actually care about people, funnily enough. And it was just, yeah, it was very horrifying in the sense that I was like, in a way it was realistic, and it showed the true, like, how cruel humans can be if put in like those kind of circumstances, do you know what I mean? And I think it did kind of honestly reflect, it didn't feel super fabricated or super fictional. I was like, no, I could kind of see this happening if it were to come about, which was definitely the scary part of it. But in terms of like, did it give me the heebie jeebies, like was it like a horror movie, was I, you know, pillow in front of my face? Not really. It's just one of those ones that it's really hard to stomach at points, and you're reading it and you're just like, oh, this is actually terrible, this is gruesome, like it's horrible. Yeah, I think overall it's a very big criticism of consumerism and humanity, And I think like the ending kind of shocked me actually a little bit. Like I think a lot of other readers, you probably read it and you kind of see it coming, but me personally, I honestly just didn't massively see it coming, and I was like, I thought it was a really interesting way to end the book. So overall, it's a really difficult one to rate because I don't feel like I can rate it highly because of how like horrible it is. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not one that you read and you enjoy, but I think in terms of the way it handled the themes and in terms of like how much it was a bit of like a think piece in a way, I think it was very well done, and I think I gave it probably around 4 stars. I then read Bunny, which initially was very confusing, and then as the book goes on, you're really just kind of having to trust the process. And I think by the end, it started to make a bit more sense, but so much of it was still like it just felt like a fever dream. It was one of those ones where like you just didn't know what was going on for majority of it. And I think as well, like she starts the book off by making like a comment pretty early on about how she just like or like she's got this thing about where she like talks about her mother before her mother died, um and it's like, oh, my mum always used to ask me like, why do I lie so much, why do I like to lie and everything, which obviously like from what I've learned from reading The Secret History and other books, that's like symptom number one of you're reading from an unreliable narrator. Do you know what I mean? But actually, that was never like massively established or like massively a thing. And I think it then meant like I almost wish I hadn't gone into it with that mindset, and I almost wish I'd been able to read it just fully believing everything she said, because instead I just never trusted a thing that came out of that girl's mouth. And I was like, okay, so like which parts of this is made up, which parts of this is real? And it's just like, actually, it would have been better just to fully trust her and then like have it all kind of happen at the end, because there was never really this thing of like, oh, she was lying or all of this were in her head. Like there was never the thing of like, oh, she's like fully delusional. Like the writer treats it as if like, no, everything that's happening is real in a way. So it was really intriguing, but it kind of like the plot wise, it follows this girl who's in this writing class at this like really like one of those like schools that focuses on the arts but goes about it in like a really wacky way, because they're like, no, we can't be confined, we have to be fun and different. And she's in a cohort with 5 other girls who are all like friends to the point where it's just like ridiculous. Like they're literally just like, the way the narrator describes it is like they're just constantly like fully attached to each other, basically sucking each other's faces off every time they go in for a hug. And like they're always wearing pink, and they all call each other Bunny, hence like the name and stuff. And eventually she ends up kind of like falling into like a friendship with them, and she ends up getting wrapped up in all of these like crazy things that they've been doing like outside of class the whole time. And it's very interesting. It's kind of verging on a 3-star or a 4-star for me. I can never figure out if I enjoyed it massively or not, because it was just very baffling the whole time. And by the end of it, I was like, okay, like I kind of wanted to get it, but I just don't know if I did. And I do kind of get it, but you had me lost for so much of it that it didn't make for like a super fun read. Do you know what I mean? Like I would have preferred to, like a part of me just like I came out of it and I was like, okay, but what was the point? You know, unfortunately. So, and it wasn't very scary. I don't know if I would have classed it as like a horror. It was quite supernatural. I wouldn't even know if I would say thriller. It is like strange and it's creepy and it has some like bizarre elements to it, but it wasn't necessarily too much of like, it wasn't horrific like at all. And so I was not scared. It definitely wasn't like a scary read or anything. And yeah, that's kind of how I felt about Bunny. I then read The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which was a collection of short stories. This one, I will say, was probably the one that kind of freaked me out the most. It was very, like, I don't know if I would necessarily say creepy. It wasn't too creepy, but it definitely didn't shy from some very, like, gruesome and explicit and kind of, like, vile elements of humanity in what people do to themselves and to each other. Like, for example, one that probably is more safe to say on the internet is there was like reoccurring instances of like people just full on shitting in the street. Like, genuinely just whipping off their trousers and taking a dump in the middle of a street, like in front of narrators. And that happened like twice. And you know, if I had a nickel for every time it happened, I'd only have 2 nickels, but it was strange that it happened twice. And they were like back to back as well. I was like, okay, guys, can we put it to rest, you know? But some of the other stuff, like when I think about it, I'm just like, oh, like I was reading it and I was like, so that one actually I was kind of reading it through squinted eyes, actually, to be honest. So that one probably takes the cake for the one that was like the most horrific, because I really was, but it was more from the sake of like, oh, I just felt like grossed out and it was just like icky at points, and I was just like, no. And even thinking about it back, I was like, I can't believe I read that. Like, that was just not pleasant. But that being said, it was very like good and it was very well written, and I felt like the narrative style was really interesting. It was one of those ones where it had like a very like, it was a mix between something that felt like it was like a myth and something that felt like it was like folklore, like one of those stories that you felt like could have been passed down through word of mouth, one of like the old kind of fairy tales with like a moral. But it was also set in like modern Argentina, because this one was also set in Argentina, interestingly, which was really cool. And so yeah, there was also like references to so many like modern little things. It just got like interwoven into this like fairy tale style creepy tale, because I've definitely like in my childhood, or like, you know, kind of just growing up or just in passing, like heard little like creepy stories that just have like a moral in there, like a little short story, and you're just like, oh, that was kind of like, oh. And it was just like a big collection of those, which I really enjoyed. But yeah, some of them I didn't enjoy as much. I will also say this one probably takes the cake for like creepiness, because the first one is called Angelita Unearthed, and it's about this like baby that dies and then gets buried in the back garden, and then like it kind of ends up like coming to haunt like this like, you know, great niece of the baby, basically. And it ended up like spurring a dream that I then had the next night, because I ended up having a dream where like I was just wandering around this like labyrinth of like a building, and then suddenly I saw this baby that had been abandoned, and I was like, okay, like that's normal in this dream world. But I came back and the baby was still there, so I was like, oh shit, like it's actually been abandoned, like I need to take this child and look after this child. And then the child started growing at an exponentially fast rate that shouldn't have been possible. And at one point it started criticizing the clothes I'd crocheted it. I was like, Pookie, I've just gone and made you clothes, my own blood, sweat, and tears, and you don't like them? Can we just wait? I've had you for like 24 hours. I haven't had time to go to the store yet. They're all shut. And that was just, yeah. Anyway, that's how I felt about those 3 novels. On the whole, I'd say I'm still not quite satisfied in finding a horror novel that really genuinely is just like scary in a way a horror movie is scary, you know? I'm still trying to figure out whether the 2 mediums of horror can relate, if that makes sense. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I definitely find it very interesting. I enjoyed my few weeks of reading horror, and I would kind of, if you're interested in exploring horror, I feel like these were pretty decent, good places to start. But again, would I say it was horrifying? Would I say it was scary? No. Gruesome, disturbing, bizarre, yes. And that is my official, professional, if you will, prognosis. Thank you. Goodbye.